that as the scriptures are read and your word is proclaimed, we may hear with joy what you say to us today. Amen. I invite you to hear the word of God as it comes to us from John chapter 18, verses 12 to 27. So the soldiers, their officer, and the Jewish police arrested Jesus and bound him. First, they took him to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was better to have one person die for the people. Simon Peter and another disciple followed Jesus. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter was standing outside at the gate. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out, spoke to the woman who guarded the gate, and brought Peter in. The woman said to Peter, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the slaves and the police had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing round it and warming themselves. Peter also was standing with them and warming himself. Then the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard what I said to them. They know what I said." When he had said this, one of the police standing nearby struck Jesus on the face, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered, "If I have spoken wrongly, testify to the wrong. But if I have spoken rightly, why do you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. They asked him, "You are not also one of the disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Again Peter denied it, and at that moment the cock crowed. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Chapter 18 of John's Gospel is kind of a pivotal one in that it begins moving us frantically toward Jesus' death. It began, you didn't hear, with Jesus being betrayed by Judas, who led soldiers and police and religious authorities to Jesus. And then in the next piece of the chapter, which I had Mary read, which would have been what I preached on last week if I had been here, we have Simon Peter denying that he knew Jesus, not once but 3 times. And then today's verses move us even closer, starting with verse 18 or 28. Then they took Jesus from Caiaphas to Pilate's headquarters. It was early in the morning. They themselves did not enter the headquarters so as to avoid ritual defilement and to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." The Jews replied, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill what Jesus had said when he indicated the kind of death he was to die. Then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate asked him, "So you're a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Pilate asked him, "What is truth?" After he had said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, "I find no case against him. But you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews?" They shouted in reply, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a bandit. Truth is at the crux of this story. The truth about the religious authorities and the crowd, the truth about Jesus, and although he likely doesn't realize it, the truth about Pilate. And the truth is, not all the characters emerge from this encounter with integrity intact. In this clash of cultures and values, Roman Empire versus established religion versus the kingdom of a God, truth is the casualty. Well, truth and Jesus. In their desire to remain ritually pure for the Passover, the religious leaders opt to have Pilate do their dirty work for them. "We're not permitted to put anyone to death," they say aloud, "but we're fine if you do," is the unspoken rest of that exchange. So they hand Jesus over to Governor Pilate, the empire's representative, to act as judge and executioner, freeing them to enjoy their holiday without the burden of blood on their hands. This encounter is, for all intents and purposes, the trial to decide whether Jesus will live or die. You might think that getting to the truth would be Pilate's primary motivation and goal, but when Jesus definitively states that he's all about the truth, Pilate responds cynically, "What's truth?" And we're left with the distinct impression that he doesn't much care what the truth is. This is a story common to all four Gospels, which means, scholars tell us, that it has a high degree of authenticity. The Gospel writers each handle it a little differently, but all agree that Jesus' basic answer to Pilate's question, "Are you the King of the Jews?" is essentially, "You say so." Jesus doesn't give a direct yes, not because he's hiding the truth. The safe answer for him would have been a definitive no, but safe isn't ever Jesus' style. He says, in essence, it depends on what you mean by a king, which, if you think about it, is a perfectly honest response. His version of royalty looks a whole lot different from Pilate's. To Pilate, a king is a decidedly political figure. A king is the supreme commander, military leader, law and order dispenser, national security provider, tax imposer, land and institution owner. A king is someone who demands the undivided loyalty of every subject and punishes those who fail to comply. Kingship and power to Pilate are about control, about making others with less power do whatever he wants them to do, about flaunting his supremacy and hurting or killing anyone who gets in his way. In Pilate's eyes, a king most definitely is not a guy who hangs out with lowlifes, encourages people to give away their possessions, counsels them to treat others as they would like to be treated, and invites, rather than forces, others to pledge their allegiance to him. And again, with utter truthfulness, Jesus says, "My kingdom is not from this world," illuminating the stark contrast between his mission and the empire that Pilate represents. The rest of his answer, "If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over," is another indication that he's a king, unlike all other kings, with an expectation that his followers will behave differently than the followers of all those other kings. And the other profession that Jesus makes to Pilate during this trial is this: "I was born and I was sent here to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." So just listen for a minute to what Jesus says in the Gospels about the truth he has come to proclaim. "God has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you." And more truth. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, those who mourn, those who are meek, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, those who are merciful, those who are pure in heart, those who are peacemakers. You are the light of the world," is another of his truths. "Let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven." Or more truth. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and all your strength. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." His is a radically different kind of kingdom and a radically different kind of truth. But with religious authorities breathing down his neck and a restless crowd outside his door, Pilate needs to make a swift decision about the man who is standing in front of him. He's not interested in theological discussions or philosophical debates about leadership. He is just waiting for Jesus to give him something, anything that Jesus can use to either cut him loose or send him to his execution. But Jesus never makes it really easy for the ones in power, does he? Which is why we can almost hear the exasperation in Pilate's voice when he says, "What is truth?" Well, if truth were really important to Pilate, he'd recognize his own impatience. He'd separate his scorn for the Jews from the drama going on outside his door. He'd be at least a little curious, you'd think, about Jesus' claims of a kingdom. He'd call in a few witnesses, Jesus' followers as well as his adversaries. But as he moves between Jesus and those railing for his execution, Pilate comes across as aggrieved and aggravated at having to be the decider in chief. And it makes me wonder, even with all his power, if Pilate isn't just a little bit fearful of the consequences of truth. That maybe Jesus really is some kind of king whose rule might threaten the peace and security of Judea and of Pilate's life, so that he isn't willing to hear anything. And because of that, we know everything we need to know about Pilate. He doesn't belong to the truth because he doesn't listen to Jesus' voice. And neither do the crowds who are witnesses to the spectacle of injustice and who are no less guilty than their leaders or the governor. They ignore Pilate's conclusion that Jesus doesn't appear to be guilty, and they appeal for the death penalty for him and freedom for Barabbas the bandit, because truth doesn't matter to them. The truth matters a lot to John, the writer of this story. The Greek word for truth appears 25 times in John's gospel, as compared to once in Matthew and 3 times each in Mark and Luke. It doesn't mean that the other gospel writers don't care about the truth, but for John, truth has a lot to do with who Jesus is. Well, we who are living in the era of fake news and slippery slopes and alternative facts ought to be asking ourselves, what is truth to? And how much does truth matter to us? If you spend any time at all on social media, and I include Facebook in that, but there are lots of other things, you may have noticed a real lack of concern with the truth in what you read. There is truthiness, which is a good word used often by comedian Stephen Colbert to describe people's willingness to believe blatant lies and propaganda because they conform to their own opinions and resonate with their gut instincts, and not because they're based at all on logic or fact. Truth is the primary casualty of truthiness. And just this week, the results of a wide-ranging study about truth and social media were published in Science magazine. And I'll tell you, the results are depressing. The preliminary question for the MIT researchers who conducted the study was, interestingly enough, this very biblical question we're thinking about today. What is truth? And next, how do we know it? And their curiosity was piqued because of personal experience. Because these researchers who did this study were all living in Boston at the time of the bombing during the Boston Marathon in 2013. And all of them found themselves at home on lockdown in the day or days following the bombing. You remember when the great manhunt for the bombers was underway, and they were trying to rely on social media for information about what was going on. And they learned after the fact that much of what passed for news wasn't really true. So they decided to study that. And they analyzed every major controversial news story in English that has ever appeared on Twitter. 126,000 stories tweeted by 3 million users over more than 10 years. And what they found was deeply disturbing. Anybody here on Twitter? Just curious. Okay, we got a couple. We need to keep an eye on you. Falsehood consistently dominates the truth on that medium. Fake news, alternative facts, hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and rumors reach more people, penetrate deeper into the social network, and spread much faster than accurate stories. And that's consistent no matter what the subject. Stories about business, war, terrorism, entertainment, science, technology, lies are spread more quickly than truth. And can you guess the main subject where fake news outperforms all others? Politics, yes. And Twitter officials, like those at other social media sites, we are learning, claim that they can't police their sites for fake news stories. One company executive at Twitter stated, "We aren't the arbiters of truth." Isn't that exactly what Pilate said, standing before Jesus? And if that's not bothersome enough, the fact that lies are more easily accepted and shared than truth, listen to this. The research has determined that the success of lies isn't about robots sending these stories out. It is about human beings. Yeah, I expect. It's a sign. The bottom line is that we like our versions of the truth, even if they are false, more than we want the real truth. And that sounds a lot like the crowds screaming for Jesus to be put to death, even though there is no evidence of his guilt. So how do we, as faithful followers of Jesus in the 21st century, how do we listen for the voice of Jesus, which will always be at odds with prevailing messages of the kingdoms of the world? And how do we share that truth in a culture that is increasingly resistant to it? Well, partly I think we remember that the question for us isn't so much what is truth as who is truth, right? And the answer isn't so much about spewing right answers and correct doctrine as it is about being in right relationship with our truth, who is Jesus. We have lots of powerful tools, don't we, to share that truth, to share God's love, and to witness to Him. But as the study showed us, and as your own experience on Facebook, or reading the comments in any section of any blog anywhere, those tools can be used just as powerfully to spread hate and lies and injustice as to speak to truth. So we have to be so careful in our social media use and in our conversation to be proclaimers of good news and purveyors of God's grace and love. And I would suggest that if it isn't love you're sharing, it isn't truth. So wherever we go and whatever we're doing and whatever conversation we're having, our words and our actions have to reflect that truth. If anybody's ever going to have trust in what we proclaim. Pilate's question is one that we ask too. Is Jesus king? There are lots of kings, lots of kingdoms. But maybe more specifically, the question is Jesus my king? Jesus never answers that question directly. It was for Pilate to decide, and it's up to us to decide as well. We know where Pilate eventually came down. He had Jesus' blood on his hands. But what about you? To say Christ is king implies that we are his subjects and that we are invested in making his kingdom a reality. So are you committed to doing the justice that Jesus asks us to do? Do you choose to give your loyalty solely to him? Or do the other powers that be, national, political, or economic, have a piece of your heart as well? Do you choose to look to Jesus as your moral and ethical authority? Or are there others in your sight? Do you choose to wield your own power like the self-sacrificing servant king he is? Or do you choose to emulate the powers of the world, where ruthlessness, violence, exploitation, selfishness, and downright lies are the weapons of choice? In all honesty and truthfulness, do you listen for Jesus' voice? Do you?